It was a bright, sunny morning when Donna Roberts walked into the busy airport. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she made her way toward the gate. Her clothes were simple but elegant. A fitted blazer and trousers, the kind that made her stand out without saying a word. But as Dana stepped into the terminal, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her eyes scanned the room, and she noticed a few curious glances, some subtle, others not so much. She was used to it. Being a black woman in a high-ranking job had always meant she was watched more closely than others. Her flight was a routine one, nothing special. A quick 2-hour flight to meet some colleagues, handle a few reports. But today, she would encounter something that would change everything. As she made her way to the boarding gate, Dana smiled politely at the airline staff. The woman behind the counter greeted her warmly, checking her ticket. She was used to this, the usual pleasantries before the flight began. But Dana could feel something off in the air. Just as she was about to walk toward the jetway, a tall man in a uniform walked by. His name tag read Captain Hayes. Dana gave him a nod, a friendly acknowledgement, but instead of returning the greeting, the pilot's eyes narrowed as he glanced at her. Without saying a word, Captain Hayes turned his head and whispered to his co-pilot, who stood beside him. Dana could read his lips. She's probably sneaking into first class. Her heartbeat quickened, but she kept walking, pretending she hadn't heard. She wasn't a stranger to this kind of treatment, but that didn't make it any easier. There was something about the way he had looked at her that sent a chill down her spine. As she entered the plane, Dana was greeted by the flight attendants. They smiled, but the smiles felt fake. One of the attendants led her to her seat in business class, and Dana sat down, adjusting her bag beside her. It wasn't long before Captain Hayes appeared in the aisle. He was checking the rows, walking past the passengers, making sure everything was in order. But as he neared Dana's seat, he stopped. His eyes locked onto her, and his lips curled into a thin smile. A smile that didn't reach his eyes. Dana looked up, her expression neutral. "Is there a problem, Captain?" she asked calmly. Captain Hayes leaned forward slightly, his voice low but loud enough for those around them to hear. "I don't know, ma'am," he said, glancing at her ticket. "It seems you're sitting in a premium seat. Are you sure you're in the right place?" Dana's eyebrows lifted, but she didn't let her anger show. She had heard this before. People assumed she didn't belong. She politely handed him her boarding pass. "I believe I am, Captain," she said, her tone steady. For a moment, Hayes didn't move. He stared at the ticket like it might change. Then, with a sharp motion, he turned and walked away, muttering something under his breath. Dana could hear him clearly. "Figures," he said. "She's probably just trying to get into first class." Other passengers around her exchanged uncomfortable glances, but nobody spoke up. They didn't want to make waves. The plane was already beginning to fill up, and most were just eager to settle into their seats. Dana sank into her chair, exhaling quietly. She had been through far worse than this, and yet it never got easier. She had spent years climbing the ranks of the law enforcement world, fighting for every inch of respect she had earned. But even now, in a place like this, people still doubted her. Her fingers gripped the armrest, and she focused on her breathing. This wasn't the time to let emotions take over. She had a job to do, one that didn't involve arguing with a pilot who clearly had issues with her presence. As the plane started to taxi down the runway, Dana's thoughts drifted back to the mission she had been on. She was an undercover agent, part of a team working to uncover discrimination in air travel. Today was supposed to be just another routine check. But she had no idea that the very man who was treating her like she didn't belong was about to make her job much more complicated. Captain Hayes took his place in the cockpit, his voice coming through the intercom as the flight attendants prepared for takeoff. Dana closed her eyes for a moment, thinking about the mission ahead. She had to remain calm. She had to stay focused. But just as she settled into her seat, she overheard the co-pilot mutter something to Hayes. Is she really who I think she is? Captain Hayes responded with a laugh. I don't know, but I'm pretty sure she doesn't belong here. The words stung. Dana's eyes snapped open, and she stared ahead, her pulse quickening. She had to keep her cool. She was ready for this. But what she didn't know was that this one flight, was about to turn into the biggest challenge of her career. And Captain Hayes, he had no idea who he was dealing with. The plane soared higher into the sky, cutting through the clouds. Inside, the hum of the engines and the occasional chatter of passengers filled the air. But for Dana, everything felt distant. She sat back in her seat, trying to relax, but Captain Hayes's words kept ringing in her ears. She doesn't belong here. The nerve of him. He had no idea who she really was, or why she was on this flight. She was used to being underestimated, but this was different. This time, her mission was more important than ever. Dana glanced out the window, trying to focus. She could feel the eyes of the passengers on her, some curious, some judgmental. The air around her felt thick, as if everyone was watching her, waiting for her to do something wrong. It wasn't just Captain Hayes anymore. It was everyone in this tiny, confined space. A few moments passed, and Dana could feel the tension build. She looked around the cabin. Some of the flight attendants were whispering to each other, their eyes darting her way. They were uncomfortable, too. She could tell by the way they avoided her gaze. Suddenly, the voice of the flight attendant, Sarah, came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our in-flight service shortly. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts. Dana sat up a little straighter, her mind focused again. She had a job to do, and nothing was going to distract her. She had trained for situations like this. Undercover missions, dangerous people. She knew how to blend in, to keep calm under pressure. Just then, a flight attendant approached her seat, a forced smile on her face. Can I get you anything to drink, ma'am? The young woman asked. Dana nodded politely. Water, please. The attendant hesitated for a moment, looking down at Dana's seat, then quickly walked away without saying another word. Something about that interaction felt off, but Dana couldn't place it. She glanced over to the cockpit door, where she knew Captain Hayes was probably watching her. And that's when it happened. She overheard a conversation between two of the flight attendants standing near the galley. Is she really supposed to be in business class? One of them whispered. The other one laughed quietly. Doesn't look like it, but it's none of our business. Dana clenched her jaw, but kept her eyes straight ahead. They were talking about her. She had to admit, the comments stung. The whispers, the judgment. She was used to it, but it didn't make it any easier. Why did it always feel like people expected her to prove herself? But just as she was about to dismiss it, she saw Captain Hayes come out from the cockpit and make his way down the aisle. His eyes locked onto her, and for a moment, Dana wondered if he would say something more, something even more insulting. But no, he didn't speak to her. Instead, the flight had returned to a tense calm, but Dana knew better. Captain Hayes had not forgotten her, and she certainly hadn't forgotten him. Her mind was still racing, the adrenaline from the medical emergency beginning to wear off. But one thing was clear, something was off about this flight, and it wasn't just Captain Hayes's attitude. Dana sat back in her seat, staring out the window. The vast expanse of clouds beneath her seemed so peaceful, but her thoughts were far from calm. Why had Captain Hayes acted that way? Why had the flight attendants whispered about her? Her instincts told her this was no ordinary flight. She glanced at the aisle, where the flight attendants were now bustling with their regular duties, but something in their eyes caught her attention. There was fear, something they weren't hiding well. Their movements were hurried, their smiles forced. It was like they were trying to distract themselves, trying to ignore something they knew was coming. Dana shook her head and focused on the task at hand. She wasn't here to play detective or fight petty battles with the flight crew. She was here on a mission, and she needed to keep her focus. But then she heard something. A soft sound from the front of the plane, where Captain Hayes was sitting. It wasn't a loud noise, but it was enough to catch her attention. A low, grating sound, followed by what could only be described as a muffled conversation. She strained her ears, trying to make out the words. Captain Hayes's voice was clearly audible. "It's happening soon," he said, his tone low but sharp. "Everything's in place. The plan is ready." Dana's heart skipped a beat. What was he talking about? What plan? She leaned forward in her seat, trying to listen more closely. But the sounds of the cabin and the hum of the engines made it impossible to hear clearly. She had to move. She had to find out what was going on. The plane was cruising at altitude, so the seatbelt sign was off. This was the perfect time for Dana to act. She slowly stood, moving as casually as possible, pretending to stretch her legs. The flight attendants were still too busy with their duties to notice her. She slipped down the aisle, her footsteps light but purposeful. Dana paused near the cockpit door. She glanced over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching. The flight attendants were distracted, and the passengers were either asleep or engrossed in their own activities. Her hand hovered near the cockpit door. She knew this was risky. She could be caught, or worse, thrown off the plane. But something told her that whatever was happening behind that door was more important than anything she had been briefed on. It was her only lead. Before she could make a move, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. Dana froze. She turned just as one of the flight attendants, Sarah, walked toward her. Sarah was the same one who had greeted Dana earlier, the one who had looked at her with that forced smile. "Oh, excuse me, Mom," Sarah said, her voice too sweet, too nervous. Dana forced a smile. "Just stretching my legs," she replied casually, trying to hide her tension. The attendant gave her a tight-lipped smile. "I just wanted to make sure you were comfortable. Let me know if you need anything," she said, her eyes darting nervously to the cockpit door. Dana nodded. "Thank you. I'm fine." The flight attendant lingered for a moment longer than necessary before turning and walking away, casting one last anxious glance at the cockpit. Dana's eyes narrowed. There was definitely something strange going on here. But what? She waited a few more moments, watching Sarah disappear into the back of the plane. Then, with a deep breath, Dana turned back to the cockpit door. She needed to know what Hayes was planning. She had to stop whatever it was before it got worse. As she stepped closer, she heard the voices again, clearer this time. Captain Hayes and his co-pilot were speaking, their words low but urgent. "Are the coordinates confirmed?" the co-pilot asked. "Yes," Hayes replied. "Everything is set. We're moving into Phase 2. Phase 2. Dana's pulse quickened. What did that mean? She pressed her ear against the door, straining to catch more of the conversation. But then she heard a sound behind her, a sharp intake of breath. She whipped around just in time to see Captain Hayes standing at the end of the aisle, his eyes locked onto hers. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Hayes's lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't friendly. It was a smile of a man who knew something she didn't, a man who had the upper hand. "What are you doing, Miss Roberts?" he asked, his voice cold. The use of her full name sent a chill down her spine. How did he know? Who had told him? Dana's mind raced. She couldn't back down now. She couldn't let him know how shaken she was. She stood tall, meeting his gaze with a calm she didn't feel. "I was just looking for the bathroom," she said, her voice steady. But even as she spoke, she knew he didn't believe her. The smile never left Hayes's face. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning her, as if trying to see through her. "You're a long way from the restroom, Miss Roberts," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "I suggest you return to your seat." Dana didn't flinch. But she knew one thing for sure now. Whatever he was planning, she couldn't let him out of her sight. She had to stay close. She had to keep watching. As Hayes turned and walked back to the cockpit, Dana felt the weight of his eyes on her. The tension was unbearable, But Dana remained calm. She was the one in control now. The plane was now flying smoothly through the skies, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. Dana sat back in her seat, her mind racing. What did Captain Hayes mean by Phase 2? Who was he really working for? And why had he singled her out on this flight? Her eyes scanned the passengers around her, looking for any signs that they were aware of what was happening. But they were all either sleeping or lost in their own worlds, oblivious to the tension that was quickly building between her and the flight crew. The calm outside the plane was in stark contrast to the storm brewing inside it. Dana kept replaying the conversation she had overheard earlier, the cryptic words echoing in her mind. Coordinates confirmed. Phase 2. What did it mean? Why was the pilot so involved in something that clearly wasn't just about flying a plane? She couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something dangerous, something far more sinister than she had anticipated. A sudden voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, ma'am, would you like a drink?" It was Sarah, the flight attendant again. Her smile was even more forced than before, and Dana could see the fear in her eyes. Dana raised an eyebrow. "Sure, water," she said calmly, trying not to reveal the storm of thoughts swirling in her head. Sarah nodded, but there was something strange about her actions. She moved as though she was trying to keep her distance, as if Dana might suddenly do something unexpected. Dana watched her, sensing that the flight attendant knew more than she was letting on. As Sarah walked away, Dana turned her attention back to the front of the plane. Her eyes flicked over to the cockpit, where she knew Captain Hayes and his co-pilot were. She had to find out what was really going on. Her instincts told her this flight wasn't just another commercial trip. There was something much bigger at play here. She waited for a moment, then stood up. As she walked toward the back of the plane, her eyes lingered on the cockpit door. She knew she had to get closer, but she couldn't risk drawing attention to herself again. After a few steps, she noticed a man in a suit sitting by the window, looking intently at his phone. He looked familiar, but Dana couldn't quite place him. His eyes flicked up from his phone for a moment, and they met hers. There was something about the way he looked at her that made her stomach twist. Without warning, the man stood up and started walking toward the front of the plane, his eyes still on her. Dana quickly turned, feigning disinterest as she made her way toward the back. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. This wasn't just about Captain Hayes anymore. There were more people involved, and they were all watching her. She reached the galley, where she spotted Sarah again. The flight attendant was nervously speaking to one of the other crew members, her voice barely audible. Dana couldn't hear the conversation clearly, but she could see the fear in Sarah's eyes. Something was definitely off, and Dana needed to find out what. She turned and made her way back toward her seat, her mind racing. As she passed the cockpit door again, she heard voices, faint but growing louder. Captain Hayes and his co-pilot were talking, but their conversation was too muffled to make out any words. Dana stopped in her tracks. She needed to act fast. She glanced over her shoulder and noticed the man in the suit again. He was standing at the front of the plane now, looking directly at her, his gaze unblinking. Dana's heart skipped a beat. Why was he staring at her like that? Did he know something? Suddenly, the overhead speaker crackled, and Captain Hayes's voice filled the cabin. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. We are currently cruising at 35,000 feet and expect to arrive at our destination shortly. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened." It was a standard announcement, but something about the way he said it made Dana's stomach turn. As the announcement ended, Dana noticed the man in the suit moving toward her. He was getting closer. Was he following her? She took a deep breath and turned, walking briskly back to her seat. The last thing she wanted was to draw attention to herself, especially with the man and Captain Hayes, both seeming to keep a close eye on her. But just as she sat down, she felt a hand on her shoulder. She froze. "Miss Roberts, I think we need to talk." It was Captain Hayes. He had come from behind her, and his voice was cold, his tone carrying the authority of someone who wasn't asking, but demanding. She turned to face him, trying to keep her voice steady. "What do you want?" Her mind raced. What was he planning now? "Walk with me," Hayes said, his eyes narrowing slightly. There was no room for argument in his voice. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Dana stood up, her heart pounding in her chest. She glanced around the cabin quickly. The man in the suit was watching her from the front, his gaze fixed on her every move. Her instinct told her to refuse, to stay where she was and play it safe. But she knew she couldn't back down now. Whatever game they were playing, she had to be a part of it. She couldn't let them take control. With a deep breath, Dana stood up and followed Captain Hayes down the aisle. They walked to the back of the plane, out of view from most of the passengers. The noise of the cabin faded as they reached a quiet area near the emergency exit. Hayes turned to face her, his expression hard. "I know who you are," he said, his voice low. "But I don't think you know what you're really dealing with." Dana's heart raced. This was the moment of truth. She had to be ready. But what was Hayes about to reveal? Audience suspense. What does Captain Hayes know about Dana? What's the real reason he's targeting her? Who is the man in the suit, and what role does he play in all of this? The hum of the plane and the low murmur of voices seemed to fade as Dana stood face to face with Captain Hayes. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay calm. This was it, the moment she had been dreading, but also waiting for. She couldn't back down now. She had to know the truth. "I know who you are," Hayes repeated, his cold eyes never leaving hers. "You're not just another passenger on this flight." Dana's heart skipped a beat. How did he know? Had he been watching her from the start? Or had he been briefed about her? She had to stay in control. If he thought she was scared, she would lose her edge. Dana took a deep breath, her voice steady. "What do you mean?" "I'm just a passenger," she said, playing it cool. Her eyes never left his, but inside, her mind was racing. What was Hayes trying to say? Captain Hayes stepped closer, his presence imposing. "Not just a passenger, Miss Roberts. You're a law enforcement officer, a top investigator, to be precise." Dana's breath caught in her throat. How did he know? Her identity was supposed to be a secret, part of a covert operation. She had kept it hidden from everyone, even from the people she was supposed to trust. But somehow, Captain Hayes knew. "I don't know what you're talking about," Dana said, her voice firm. She had to deny it, at least for now. If Hayes knew, then he was far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. Hayes smirked, a knowing look in his eyes. "Oh, I think you do. You've been following me, haven't you? But the real question is why? What is it that you think I'm involved in?" Dana's mind raced, her thoughts scrambled. She had been sent to investigate a dangerous syndicate operating out of the aviation industry, but she hadn't expected it to lead to a confrontation like this. She hadn't expected Hayes to know so much about her. What did he have to do with the syndicate? Was he part of it? "I'm not following you," she said, her tone sharper now. "I'm here on a routine flight. Nothing more." Hayes shook his head, his smirk turning into something more sinister. "No, you're not. You're here because you know what's going to happen, don't you? You know that this flight is just the beginning." Dana's stomach churned. Her instincts were screaming that something was terribly wrong. She had to get to the bottom of this. She couldn't let him manipulate her. "What do you mean?" she asked, forcing the words out. She wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer, but she had no choice. The captain's eyes glinted with cold amusement. "Phase 2 is set in motion. This flight is only the start of something much bigger. And you, Miss Roberts, have just walked right into the middle of it." Dana felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Phase 2. What did that mean? Was it some kind of attack? What were they planning, and how was she involved? She needed to stay focused. She needed to get information, but she also had to get out of here before things escalated further. As if reading her mind, Hayes chuckled. "Don't bother trying to stop it. You're too late. Dana's heart raced faster. Too late. What did he mean by that? Just as she was about to press him for more answers, the man in the suit appeared at the end of the aisle, his eyes fixed on Dana. It was the same man who had been watching her earlier. His expression was unreadable, but the tension in the air thickened as he slowly made his way toward them. Dana tensed, but she didn't show fear. She couldn't afford to let them see it. She had to act, and fast. The man in the suit stopped next to Captain Hayes, his eyes briefly flicking toward Dana before locking onto Hayes. "It's time," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "We're ready to move forward." The look that passed between the two men sent a chill down Dana's spine. Hayes turned to Dana, a cold smile on his lips. "You see, Miss Roberts, you're not just a law enforcement officer. You're a pawn in a much bigger game." He paused, allowing the words to sink in. "And now that you know too much, there's nothing left for you to do but watch it unfold." Dana's mind was racing. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had been investigating something far bigger than she realized. The danger was so much greater than she had ever anticipated. "Watch what unfold?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, as if fearing the answer. The man in the suit spoke up again, his voice cool and calculated. "Watch as this flight becomes the trigger for a chain of events that will change everything." He turned his gaze back to Hayes. "Are we clear to proceed?" Hayes nodded, his face hardening. "We're clear." Dana's blood ran cold. What had she stumbled into? What did this flight have to do with a bigger, more dangerous plan? And why had they targeted her? But before she could say anything more, the man in the suit turned to her with a calculating look. "You've been a problem from the start, Roberts. You've uncovered too much. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Dana's mind raced. She had to get out of this. There was no other option. But as the man in the suit moved closer to her, she realized there was no way to stop what was happening. Not unless she could act fast. The plane suddenly jolted, the seatbelt sign flashing on. "Everyone, please fasten your seatbelts." The voice of the captain echoed through the cabin. Dana barely registered the announcement. Her thoughts were too consumed with what was about to happen next. The lights in the cabin flickered, and a low hum filled the air as the plane continued its flight. Dana's mind raced, her thoughts a blur. She was sitting in her seat, strapped in, trying to make sense of everything that had just happened. Captain Hayes and the man in the suit knew far too much about her. She had stumbled into something so dangerous, so far-reaching, that she wasn't sure she could stop it. The plane jerked slightly as it hit some turbulence, but Dana barely noticed. Her heart pounded in her chest as she watched the two men, Hayes and the stranger, exchanging cold looks. What were they planning? What was this phase 2 that they kept talking about? And why had they involved her in this twisted game? She glanced at the other passengers, trying to gauge if anyone else noticed what was happening. But they were all either asleep or distracted by their own devices, blissfully unaware of the impending danger. To them, this was just another ordinary flight. But to Dana, it felt like the calm before a storm. The seatbelt sign flickered again, and an announcement crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching a restricted area. Please remain seated and follow all crew instructions." Dana's stomach dropped. A restricted area. Why were they heading toward one? She had no idea, but her instincts told her that something bad was about to happen. She needed to act fast. But what could she do? The man in the suit, still standing at the front of the plane, turned and locked eyes with her again. His cold, emotionless gaze sent a shiver down her spine. It was as if he could see right through her, reading her every move. Dana quickly turned her attention back to Captain Hayes, who was now looking out of the cockpit door, speaking softly to the co-pilot. Dana had to get to the cockpit. She couldn't just sit there and wait for whatever they had planned. She had to stop this. She stood up, trying to move casually, but her legs felt heavy. Every step felt like it took her further into danger. The man in the suit noticed her movement and his expression darkened. But he didn't stop her. Instead, he looked at Hayes, as if silently signaling him to let her make her move. Dana reached the aisle, her heart racing faster. She knew she had to act quickly, but she didn't know how much time she had. Every second felt like a lifetime as she moved toward the cockpit. The plane hit another patch of turbulence, and she staggered slightly. It was as if the very air around her was charged with something, an electric tension that made her skin prickle. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached the cockpit door and knocked softly, trying to make herself as inconspicuous as possible. The door opened slightly, and Captain Hayes' cold, calculating eyes met hers. "You really think you can stop this, don't you?" he said quietly, almost as if he were amused. His voice was calm, but there was a hint of something dangerous beneath it. Dana's pulse quickened, but she fought to stay composed. "I don't know what you're planning," she said, her voice steady despite the fear twisting inside her. "But I'm not going to let it happen." Hayes chuckled darkly. "You think you have the power to stop this? You have no idea what's coming." Before she could respond, a loud, blaring alarm cut through the cabin, followed by a voice over the intercom. "Warning. Security breach detected. All crew members, please prepare for immediate action." The passengers started to stir, murmurs of confusion filling the air. Dana's heart skipped a beat. A security breach. What was happening? She could see the panic starting to spread across the faces of the flight attendants and the crew. But Hayes didn't move. He didn't seem alarmed at all. He simply turned to his co-pilot and gave a brief nod. Suddenly, the man in the suit stepped forward and stood next to Hayes, his gaze still locked on Dana. "This is your last chance to walk away, Miss Roberts," he said, his voice icy. "You can stay out of this, or you can get involved and watch everything fall apart." Dana's mind raced, but she couldn't back down now. She had to know what they were doing. She had to stop it. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor of fear in her chest. The man in the suit gave a sharp nod to Hayes, and the captain pressed a button on the cockpit panel. A low hum filled the cabin, and the plane suddenly dipped, making Dana's stomach lurch. The seatbelt sign flashed again, and the passengers gasped in alarm. "Captain," one of the flight attendants shouted, rushing toward the cockpit. But Hayes raised a hand to stop her. "This is out of your hands," he said calmly, turning his attention back to Dana. "It's too late now. The plan is already in motion." Dana felt a cold rush of dread as the plane tilted again, this time at a steeper angle. Was this it? Were they about to crash? Was this all part of their twisted plan? She turned quickly, glancing around the cabin. The man in the suit was now walking toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. His eyes were fixed on her, his expression unreadable. As he got closer, Dana felt a sudden surge of adrenaline. Without warning, she lunged for the nearest emergency exit, her fingers brushing against the handle. But the man caught her wrist, his grip like iron. "Don't even think about it," he said coldly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You've already made your choice. Now you'll have to live with the consequences." Dana fought to free herself, but it was no use. The man's strength was overpowering. She had to find another way out, but time was running out. The plane jolted again, harder this time, and the overhead compartments opened, spilling luggage into the aisles. The warning bells blared louder, the chaos intensifying. As the man dragged her back toward the seats, Dana's eyes scanned the cabin one last time. Her gaze landed on the flight attendants, who were scrambling to control the situation. But they were all too scared to do anything. Everything was spiraling out of control. And the worst part was, Dana didn't know how much time they had left. The plane jolted violently, sending passengers screaming and clutching onto their seats. Dana's heart raced, her mind struggling to process everything happening at once. The security breach. The strange, cold behavior of Captain Hayes and the man in the suit. The descent of the plane into chaos. She couldn't stop it, and yet she had to. If she didn't do something soon, She might not make it off this flight alive. She fought against the man's grip, her wrist throbbing under his tight hold. But it was no use. He was too strong. He dragged her back down the aisle as the turbulence made the plane lurch once again, even worse than before. The passengers screamed in panic, some crying out, others clutching their loved ones. But Dana couldn't afford to focus on them. She had to think fast. "Where are you taking me?" she demanded, her voice shaking but determined. The man didn't answer. His face was expressionless, cold, and calculating, as if this was all part of a bigger plan that she couldn't even comprehend. Dana struggled to break free from his grip, but he wasn't going to let her go. "I won't let you stop it," he said in a low voice, his words carrying a threat that sent a shiver down her spine. Dana's mind raced. She had to find a way to stop this. What was Phase 2? What was the plan? She had no answers, and time was running out. As they reached the back of the plane, Dana finally noticed something that sent a cold wave through her chest. The emergency exit doors had been tampered with. The locks were disabled. Whoever was behind this had been planning this for far longer than she could have imagined. The man in the suit forced her toward the emergency exit, his grip tightening on her wrist. Dana's eyes darted around, trying to find anything that could help her. But all she saw was panic. The passengers were now fully aware that something was terribly wrong. Some were even trying to leave their seats, their faces full of fear and confusion. But it was too late. They had no idea what they were up against. The man in the suit shoved Dana toward the emergency exit, and for a moment, everything felt surreal. Was this really happening? Was she about to be thrown out of the plane? But before the man could reach the door, a voice rang out over the intercom, loud and clear. "Attention, all passengers and crew. This is Officer Dana Roberts. I am now in control of this situation. Everyone remain calm and do not attempt to leave your seats." Dana froze. Her heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe it. How had they known? How had the authorities intercepted the flight? The man in the suit turned sharply, his face now twisted in rage. You're a law enforcement officer." He released her wrist, taking a step back, his eyes narrowing. "I knew you were a problem, Roberts, but I didn't think you'd get this far." "Who are you?" Dana demanded, her voice steady now as she stood tall. "You're not just some hired gun. You're part of this, aren't you? What's your role in all of this?" The man laughed, a bitter, cynical sound that chilled Dana to the bone. "You have no idea what you're dealing with," he said, his eyes flashing with a cold, dangerous glint. "This whole operation is much bigger than you or me. You've only uncovered the tip of the iceberg." Dana didn't wait for him to say more. She couldn't afford to. This was her chance. She had to act before it was too late. Taking a deep breath, Dana turned and bolted toward the cockpit. She couldn't let them get away with this. She had to stop whatever Phase 2 was before they put their plan into motion. As she reached the cockpit door, she threw herself against it, desperate to get inside. She had to stop the flight, stop whatever dangerous mission Hayes and the others were trying to execute. But the door was locked. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pounded on the door with her fists. "Open the door," she shouted. "You have to stop this. They're going to crash us." The panic in her voice was unmistakable. But the door didn't budge. Hayes and his co-pilot were inside, and they weren't letting anyone in. "You can't stop this," Hayes called out from the other side, his voice cold and taunting. "We're already too far along. You can't change anything now." Dana stepped back, her mind racing. If she couldn't get into the cockpit, then she needed another way. She glanced around, and that's when she noticed something: the emergency landing gear. Her eyes locked on the control panel near the back of the plane, and a glimmer of hope sparked in her chest. If she could access the landing gear control, maybe she could force an emergency landing. It was risky, but it was the only chance she had. She rushed toward the panel, dodging passengers who were now in full panic mode. The flight attendants were shouting at everyone to stay seated, but no one was listening. Everything was falling apart. Dana reached the control panel and began working quickly. Her fingers flew over the buttons, her heart pounding in her chest as she tried to override the system. She had done this before in training, but this was different. This wasn't a drill. This was real. The plane jerked again, and Dana's stomach lurched. The emergency alarms blared louder, and the intercom crackled to life once more. Warning: imminent risk of catastrophic failure. Brace for impact, the voice on the intercom warned, sending the passengers into a new wave of panic. The explosion rattled the plane, sending a wave of panic through the cabin. The deafening sound of metal screeching filled the air, and the lights flickered, plunging the passengers into semi-darkness. Dana's heart skipped a beat as she braced herself against the violent shaking. She had just made the final adjustment to the emergency landing gear control when everything went wrong. A loud crash echoed from the back of the plane, followed by screams. Dana's thoughts raced as she staggered to her feet, gripping the nearest seat for support. What had just happened? Was it the result of something she had done, or was there another force at play? The explosion had caused a massive rupture, and now smoke began to fill the cabin. The oxygen masks dropped from above, and the passengers screamed in terror as they struggled to put them on. Through the chaos, Dana's eyes locked onto the cockpit door, knowing she had to act fast. Captain Hayes's voice crackled over the intercom, his voice calm but filled with a chilling confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you've all enjoyed the ride. We are nearing the end of this flight, and the mission will soon be complete." Dana's blood ran cold. This wasn't just an emergency landing. It was part of a much bigger plan. And they weren't done yet. She moved swiftly, pushing past the panicked passengers and the flight attendants who were trying to maintain some form of order. As she reached the front of the plane, she saw the man in the suit standing near the cockpit, his face pale and tense. He was watching her every move, as if waiting for her to make a mistake. "Don't even think about it," he warned, his voice low and filled with menace. But Dana didn't hesitate. She had to reach the cockpit before they could complete their mission. She sprinted toward him, ignoring the fear that was clawing at her chest. She had no idea what Hayes and the others were planning, but she knew one thing for sure: she couldn't let them succeed. In one swift motion, she shoved the man aside and reached for the door. But as she turned the handle, the man grabbed her arm, pulling her back. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he spat, his grip tightening around her wrist. Dana yanked her arm free, her anger burning hotter than the fear. "I know enough," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "I know you're part of something much bigger, something that's going to hurt a lot of people. And I'm not going to let you finish what you started." She swung open the cockpit door, and before the man could stop her, she was inside. Captain Hayes turned slowly, his expression unreadable. The co-pilot, who had been silently watching the chaos unfold, didn't seem surprised to see her. They had been expecting her, perhaps. Dana stepped forward, her heart hammering in her chest. "You need to land this plane," she said firmly. "Now. There's still time to stop this." The captain's eyes narrowed, and he slowly shook his head. "You don't understand, Officer Roberts. The mission is already in motion. There's no stopping it now." Dana's stomach twisted. She knew there was something more, something that they weren't telling her. The plan was bigger than the plane, and she was standing in the middle of it. "Tell me what's really going on," Dana demanded, her voice filled with determination. "Tell me everything." Captain Hayes glanced at the co-pilot, who nodded slightly. For the first time, Hayes spoke openly, his tone cold and calculating. "This is bigger than you, Roberts. This flight was never about just getting from point A to point B. We're carrying something far more valuable than just passengers." Dana's mind raced as she processed his words. "What are you carrying?" Her voice dropped to a whisper as the realization hit her. "Is this about the virus?" Captain Hayes gave a slow, grim nod. Phase 2 was just the beginning. The real target is much more dangerous than you realize. The virus is already on board, and once we land, it will be distributed to the right people. The world will change, and it'll never be the same again. Dana's blood ran cold. She had suspected something like this, but hearing it confirmed made her sick. A deadly virus, ready to be unleashed on the world. And she was the one who had to stop it. "We won't let you," Dana said firmly, stepping closer. "You'll never get away with this." The captain's lips curled into a sinister smile. "You think you can stop us? You're too late, Roberts. The virus is already in motion. By the time we land, it'll be in the hands of the highest bidder." The co-pilot suddenly rose from his seat, pulling out a small device from his pocket. Dana's eyes widened as she realized what it was. It was a detonator. "No," Dana shouted, rushing forward to stop him. But it was too late. The co-pilot pressed the button, and the whole plane seemed to tremble. A loud, violent noise filled the air, and Dana's ears rang as the lights flickered one last time. The plane began to descend rapidly, the floor beneath her feet tilting at a dangerous angle. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Dana knew she had to act fast. She had to stop the descent and somehow regain control. But as the plane plummeted toward the earth, she realized one terrifying truth. It was too late. The explosion came from within the cockpit, a powerful blast that rocked the entire plane. Dana was thrown backward, and everything went black.